yeah, it was my fault. I would have been at fault. I would have been ticketed. And I said, but I thought it was prohibited for them to be doing that kind of work in inclement weather. And he said, did they have any signs up warning you where they were doing it? Or did they have a board on the truck? And I said, no, they didn't have a board on the truck. I said they had lights flashing because I wondered what was going on. And then I said, oh, it's a road crew. And I said, and the thing of it is, I said I was in the wrong because I passed in a no passing. But I said, I saw the road going straight. And he said, I know where you're talking about. Yeah, you got that bank curve in that road. And he said, yeah, it does look like it goes. And I said, hey, he said, what was visibility reduced because of the rain? And I said, well, reasonably. I said, I never noticed the curve. I said, it's been so long since I've been out there.
Yeah.
I forgot that spot. And he says, I know where you're talking. He said, so if he was blocking your view of the curve in poor weather, they were in violation.
Yeah.
And he said, was the block truck that was running behind him at least 100 to 150 feet behind the grader? And I said, no, he was right up on the grader.
Yeah.
I said, otherwise I would have quick cut in between him and the grader. And he said, well, what happened? I said, well, I realized there was a semi coming. I said, I got down on the brakes, but I said the rear end locked up. And I said, you heard that, you know, the wheels chirping. And I said, and the pickup, he wouldn't back out of it. He wouldn't move over. He wouldn't do nothing. And he said, yeah, he was just being a jerk. And I said, well, I figured, you know, like you've told me a lot of times, you know, all these idiots out here are just trying to run us over and hit us. He said, yeah, but we still try to accommodate when somebody messes up.
Yeah.
And I said, you know, it's a moment like that where you got no choice. I said, finally the truck caught traction, backed out of it, and I got in behind him. But I said the semi had to go over towards the shoulder, and he said, well, I'm going to tell you something. He said, that's that dopey crew out of Okmulgee. And he said, I'll say a word.
No, yeah.
Yeah. He said, I said, should I run by there and complain to the supervisor? And he said, no. He said, I'm going to call Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
And I said, well, at minimum, they need to be trained. You know, I said, at best, they would just fire the guy for being like that. But he said, oh, Dad, you know it takes an act of Congress to get somebody fired here.
Well, I don't know it's like that. What he did really deserved firing.
You know, he said they weren't supposed to be out there in that weather.
Really?
He said if they were trying to get back to the yard, he should have had the grader blade turned like this, picked up, and they should have been hauling down the highway. Not over their grading shoulders or any of that stuff.
Yeah.
And he said, was he actually? I said, he was grading. And he said, why would they be doing it in the rain anyway? Because all they're doing is making mud.
Yeah.
And he said, they weren't laying hot patch or anything. I said, no. And he said, there were no boards, no construction ahead or anything. I said, nope. And he said, that's an illegal procedure.
Wow.
And I said, and on the way back, we met them again on the one highway. And I said, they were still grading the ditch and running up that highway.
Did we? I didn't even notice on the way back.
You know, after we came past the college, you hung the left there, and we went on down. They were down that road coming. Yeah, he said, yeah, they're heading back to the yard, but doing work while they're... And I said, well, it wasn't raining there at that time. And he said, well, how hard was it raining? I said, hard enough. I needed the wipers on continuous. You know, I said it wasn't pouring or anything like that, but the roads were wet enough that the rear end lost traction the minute I hit the brakes a little on the hard side. And he said, well, I'm going to say something to him. He said, because that's definitely a serious, you know, violation.
Yeah.
And
yeah, that was almost a bad
and I said,
deal.
the thing of it is, he wouldn't move over. If he had just moved over, I could have come in right next to him. And I said, what's the worst that would have happened? I would have hit the road grader. And I said, we still would have taken the worst of it hitting a road grader. He goes, yeah. You're not going to wreck a road grader. You might ding in the shroud or something, but and I said, but we weren't really that fast at that moment. And I said I was almost considering, if he wouldn't move out of the way, I was going to push him off in the ditch. And I said, because I'm not hitting a semi.
No kidding.
And I said, I'm very thankful that the semi driver was well aware of what was going on, and he got over.
Yeah.
But and he said, yeah, that was uncalled for. And he said, I'll make a note to the safety department about that. So
That's good.
and they probably will just say naughty, 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 don't do it again. And hey,
Yeah.
if you guys are out there in that kind of weather, you better have. He said they should have had 3 or 4 trucks back there with flashing the arrow sign on the or road crew ahead or something.
Yeah.
He said, because just a pickup with flashing lights, that's not,
Yeah. Yeah, I imagine that being he knows today and everything, they probably couldn't. They probably know exactly.
Yeah, he
what
said,
crew
did you
it
by
was.
any chance get the truck number? And I said, well, no. I said, but how many road graders and crews are out from,
Right.
And I said, it said right on the truck, ODOT.
Yeah.
So I said it wasn't like it was county or, a local community or anything like that.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got a yard there just south of Okmulgee. As you're coming north up 75, you can see it off down in there.
Is that the one I'm thinking of where they keep piles of salt when the winter's starting to come on or something?
They got a big salt barn down in there.